If you would, please help me welcome Steve Melzer.
Good morning. I'd like to take you on a journey. We're going to journey down the residual oil zone pathway. So let's take a field trip. It all started here. It became obvious to some of us that there were some unusual oil shows below the oil water contact in many of these fields, St. Andrews fields in West Texas. And the model that we've all learned in our schooling has been something like this, where you have a transition zone where the surface tension and capillarity forces control the attenuation, if you will, of the oil saturations with depth below the oil water contact. We knew there was a transition below that, and so we generally just lumped it into transition zone thinking. And so this one presents a bit of an enigma. It's a little thick, so what do? Well, the best fit to this looks to be something like this now, with a transition on top and a transition on bottom, separated by a pretty thick zone of nearly constant oil saturations. And that had us scratching our head for a long time. So knowing that that's maybe the better fit, and sometimes it's, 300 feet thick, sometimes it's 100 feet thick, sometimes it's not present. But in the St. Andrews, underneath our St. Andrews oil fields, it generally was present. And in this particular case, those oil shows were 450 feet thick. The fascinating thing is this particular example comes from an area without a main pay zone. So what we did is we said, okay, let's take a theory that maybe that this was the base of a Paleo Trap. In other words, sometime in the geologic past, we had a bigger trap than what we had currently at discovery time. So we ended up with a Paleo Trap that was much, much thicker. And this is an example at Seminole Field in Gaines County where we've seen some idealization, if you will, of the oil saturation of the field with depth being something like this. This is the conventionally productive zone above the oil water contact in green there, with oil saturations generally ranging at about 85%. In other words, 15% of the fluids were water. And then we had the yellow zone, which in this case was pretty thick. Then we had what we called the paleo transition zone at the bottom, where it fell off to zero. But, before the year 2000, we would call this oil reservoir profile transition zone, even though it really did stretch our imagination to do that. This one particularly was 300 to 400 feet thick, depending on where you were in the field, and so quite a challenge to our concept of transition zones. And in some other areas, they had seen the same thing. They just kind of lumped it into this upper part, transition zone / ROZ, and left it at that and forgot about this zone below. What we did is we said, okay, there's some theories out there that the St. Andrews was laterally water swept in its geologic past. So I started thinking about this zone here that could be laterally swept. And I would say, too, that Hess had named this interval residual oil zone. So taking that and sitting at a table in Washington one day with the Department of Energy, I was talking about this and the theory that we had developed back in about the 2005 timeframe, and I said, we probably need to dive into this in a major way. Some of the major oil companies have really understood these zones a little better than what's in the literature. So let's tackle that. So let's take a upper left view of a hypothetical, and that zone can be very thick. In other words, the Paleo Trap wasn't that whole interval of porosity. It was just the upper part. So we like to call that the pervasively dolomitized interval, sometimes including the ROZ, sometimes leaving it out, but anyway, we call it the PDI. And so let's look at a couple of examples of that. North Central Yoakum County cross-section, where this is all of the St. Andrews producing wells in the Permian Basin. And obviously it's a broad area. You can see it's well over 200 miles wide of St. Andrews production throughout the basin. And it's, as I think was mentioned, 1,400 feet thick in most places. And so we've got a really good area up here on the north, concentrated. We've got, this would be the Northwest Shelf, and then down here we've got the Central Basin Platform. So let's look in Yoakum County right here. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this very well, but right in the central northern part of it, we've got a cross section we put together that'll show us PDI. And so here's an example. Now I've emphasized here this difference between about 5 or 6% of the porosity from the formation density and the neutron porosity. Sometimes this gets up into the higher numbers too, 15%, but generally typically we'll see 10 or 12% porosity in this interval. And I've highlighted in yellow, and this is just over about a little over a 6 mile cross section. Two things to note. Number one, the porosity is thick and it's laterally continuous. So this area had a great deal of energetic carbonate deposition. And then we call this lower zone the interbedded zone in this particular area. And down here we've got just an enormous porosity, the yellow house zone we call it. That was a really widespread porosity interval just above the Glorieta Formation. This cross section is a stratigraphic one. We hung it on the Glorieta datum point in these logs. Next, we'll go to Gaines County and really quickly look at this. And this is a cross section that kind of runs northwest southeast through the lower half of the county. And we'll take a peek at the continuous nature of the porosity interval here. I didn't have time to highlight all the yellow in this, but you can see this good porosity zone here that's continuous all the way down to Andrews County on the south. And this is 15 mile long cross section, huge porosity section in the Sanders, and this is quite typical, I would add, to a lot of the Central Basin Platform, and to a degree, very typical up in the Northwest Shelf. In our work in characterizing the ROZ fairways, we definitely would look at the zone and track it. So you can see this baby is really, really thick. It's 500 feet thick right there, and now it's actually more like 700 feet thick, and then it's got this interval below. Just imagine how much pore space is available there for something like CO2, anthropogenic CO2. And it's a wonderful opportunity to exploit down the road when we're trying to figure out how to minimize our carbon footprint at the surface. Before we stop, though, I want to take a quick environmental sidebar. And how do these new ROZ understandings relate to CO2? We can store large quantities of CO2 during EOR, and it's now, I would say, widely understood around the world, perhaps. And we have the test bed at the Permian Basin to demonstrate that with almost 80 projects ongoing.